Hey guys, so today's lesson is on how to win, just to make sure you win, how to crush your opponent. I've played one game today and that one game was enough. I've absolutely annihilated my opponent, and so this is what I want to try and explain during this game, is that you need to develop, in order to improve in chess, that you don't play guess chess. Right? Don't say, "Oh, that move looks all right. That might do." You need to be saying to yourself, do I have a plan for winning this game? What will it take to win this game? Right? Now, clearly, the first thing that you always have to bear in mind, like I say, king safety is number one, right? Because in order to win a game, you have to not lose it first. So you have to take that into account. So what we're going to see in this game is my effort to get some advantage, right? And then to secure that advantage, to press it home, and then to simplify and end up with a winning position that my opponent just goes, I can't play on. Okay, so we'll go through it. So I'm here, I've got the white pieces, and I play e4, e5, knight to c3, the Vienna game. And now this is one of the least interesting ways it can go, with knight to c6. And the move is bishop c4, and then we have a symmetrical position with bishop to c5. So right now, there's not too much in it, okay? So what I need to do now is I need to try and press home. I need to find some kind of edge. I need to break this symmetry, and I need to force my opponent to start doing things he doesn't want to do. Now, normally, if this knight wasn't here and the bishop comes out, and this bishop wasn't here, so we'll just go back a couple of moves. Okay, so if the bishop comes out on move 2, then with the Vienna, you've got this wayward queen idea, which attacks kind of the king and also potentially the pawn there, right? But here we have the knights and the bishops out as well. But I decide to deploy this wayward queen attack anyway, because I have my bishop already on c4. Okay, and so there's a checkmate threat. There's an immediate checkmate threat that my opponent needs to respond to. Now, normally in the regular wayward queen attack, when you shoot your queen out on move 2, which is not sound, right? There's no knight here protecting this pawn, so you're kind of attacking well, it's not move 2, it's like move 3. So you're potentially attacking this pawn as well. Now, that's clearly not the case. So black doesn't have to defend this pawn. So he can simply play now g6. Now, g6 is clearly already a weakening move. Right? He's started to open up this dark square diagonal towards the rook, so the rook's slightly exposed, and there may be opportunities for pieces to get in here later on, and that's absolutely fine for me. So I just do, this is the standard thing in the wayward queen. When you get the g6 kick, you just come back to f3 and renew the attack on f7. So now my opponent has to respond to that yet again, and there aren't too many options really. I mean, knight out is an idea, but then I can threaten knight to here possibly, or push d3 and bring my bishop out to pin the knight. So my opponent here plays queen to f6. Okay, now there's a few options here. One could be knight d5 is very, very thematic for the Vienna. And what we need to decide here is, when you've got a face-off like this, a beginner will very often think, now I need to resolve that tension immediately. Okay, you don't have to resolve that tension. What you have to do is you have to say, okay, if I take the queen, what's going to happen? Well, clearly we're going to have the knight will retake, and then I've lost a developed piece, so's he, but he's got an extra developed piece, and now he could even castle and go on about his day quite happily. But likewise, if black's queen takes my queen, I get to develop my knight. So what do? Nothing. Right? I'm not going to attack the queen now. And maybe knight d5 would have been the best move here, but I decided just to play d3 To release my dark squared bishop, potentially I might have ideas of like knight h3 to protect it, and then bishop to here, kicking the queen away, and the queen can't go there. So it'd probably have to come even back here, which would be weird. And now black, I think, makes an error and initiates the exchange, and that allows me to bring my knight into the fray. So I've got 2 pawns moved, right? I've got 3 minor pieces out in the board, and my dark squared bishop is able to come out, and my king can castle. Compare that to black's position. He's got 2 pawns moved, but this one's not a very good one. He's got 1 fewer minor piece out in the board. His light squared bishop here is currently trapped in by these pawns, and he can't castle. So you can see how these very small edges that you can get in the opening can lead to an early lead. Now clearly I'm playing with the white pieces, so I have the first move advantage anyway, but okay, so now black's knight comes into d4, and this is an issue. I mean, clearly c2 is vulnerable, so I could couple of options. I could move my king to d1 or d2 to defend it and then lose castling rights. I could move my bishop back here, but that's a really, really nice bishop. It's on this gorgeous diagonal there, and I don't want to lose my bishop. So, all things told, I decided to exchange knights. And now the bishop takes, and yes, my knight's under threat, so now I play d5, and now I'm attacking c7, and now black is going to have to respond. And what he does is he moves his dark squared bishop back, and this is clearly on a square where my knight could capture it if I wanted to. But look, now I've got 2 minor pieces to his 1. I've got a nice pawn structure here. Notice how many times in my games I end up with this very classic pawn structure. This is the minimum that you need to disrupt your pawns in order to get all your pieces out into the game. So in the game I decide to bring my bishop now to e3, attempting to remove the defender of the c7 pawn. So black again is forced to play a move that he probably doesn't really want to play, and that is c6, opening up another hole, making life difficult again for his king's safety in the future. Okay, so now I capture the bishop. I mean, one option could have been to capture the bishop with my bishop, but then what happens? Look, pawn takes knight, and then I've got a bishop attacked by a pawn here and a bishop attacked by a pawn here, so I'm actually going to lose a piece. So I can't do that. I can't capture with the bishop, so I capture with the knight. Black doubles his pawns, and now I've got the bishop pair. My opponent has an unpleasant pawn structure, and I have a very tidy pawn structure. So clearly, this is by move 11, I have now a tangible advantage in this game. Other imbalances, black has potentially this semi-open file on the A file. So I need to be thinking now about whether I want to castle kingside or queenside. Queenside has potential risk of this rook coming down, and my king's going to end up here, so it can't immediately defend a2. So if I was to castle now, I could simply lose that pawn to the rook. So I come in, grab the hanging pawn, and now I am 1 pawn up. And if you look now, most of black's pawns are now on light squares. So this dark squared bishop is looking very, very dominating. We have knight comes out, and I'm guessing this is in order to prepare to castle. Now I want to win this game. I want to make life difficult for my opponent. I want to unleash my evil on this opponent, right? So how can I stop him castling? Well, bishop c5 effectively kind of pins the knight. So now, if black was to castle, that knight would be undefended, and I just grab it and attack the bishop, attack the rook. Okay, so now he can't castle. So now he just kicks my light squared bishop, no problem. Just retreat to b3. Still eyeing down on this, and that actually improves my bishop. Now my bishop's twice defended, and it's also now defending this pawn, which it wasn't defending before. That pawn was actually previously undefended, and with this move it's now defended, so thank you very much, black. Now we have bishop b7, so is black considering maybe castling this way? That would seem unusual when there's a semi-open file. He's got no a pawn to defend that side of the board. So now I just advance my dark squared bishop, targeting yet another loose pawn. We have rook comes across, I grab the pawn, attacking the rook, and now black castles, right? Even though the rook's under attack, he can castle. If your king's in check, obviously you can't, but in this case it's fine. And I'm quite happy. I still have this dark squared bishop, and there are all these holes in black's position. So my dark squared bishop can very happily roam around and cause some damage. So now I simply move back to d6, pinning the knight. Now if you look at the situation, black has this horrible light squared bishop that's stuck behind his own light squared pawns. That bishop, and until pawns move, that bishop is not in the game. This rook is barely in the game, this rook is not in the game, and this knight can't move because it's pinned. So what's he going to do? So he moves his rook across, breaking the pin, and moving it onto a semi-open file, which is a very sensible move. Now I'm not about to trade my excellent bishop for this knight. So now I just push a3, just shoring up this side of the board. In case I want to castle long, I can do. I haven't decided at this point in time, but also I need to be concerned about pawn push, and then I'd have to retreat my bishop or mess up my own pawn structure and capture, which maybe I don't really want to do. And we have indeed c5, but really black has very few options now. And now I counter that with c4. So I figure that if pawn takes now, I've got bishop takes, and my bishop is still on the diagonal pointing towards his queen. If pawn pushes, I can just push a4, and life is good. Now we have the rook down to harass my bishop. Bishop simply sidesteps, no drama, no fuss, attacks again, and now my bishop comes down to c3, where it's defended by a pawn. It's also defending that pawn, which was previously, well, in fact, it was defended by the bishop there, but a couple of moves ago, it wasn't defended. Okay, undefended pawn, defended pawn. Great. Now we have knight to f5, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn on e4 is pinned, so I can't capture the knight. So what am I going to do next? Clearly, castle the king. Right, now I've got my king in a very standard, classic block in the corner. My light squared pawns are preventing this bishop from having any ideas down there, and life seems good. Now we have knight in here. Now, what black is trying to do is drop his knight into e2 with a fork on the king and my good bishop, my better bishop. I actually missed this idea because he's also attacking this bishop here, so I have to do something about that. Have to move the bishop, comes down, and now we have a fork. So good play by black. My king has to move, he grabs the bishop, I double my pawns. Okay, but it probably won't be for long because we've got some pawn tension here. If he takes, that would probably be the better move, I think, at this point, and it is indeed what he does. But now I can capture with the bishop. If I'd recaptured with the pawn, as might be your first thought, pawn's taken, take that with a pawn, it would have left me a very unpleasant situation. This pawn would have fallen very quickly, but I didn't have to worry. Bishop takes on c4, now hitting the rook, and the rook comes across to b6. So what's undefended on my side of the board? There's one pawn on c3. Basically, that's it. And I have lost my better bishop, but I am 2 pawns in front because of the way that black's pawns were forced into an untidy and clumsy position during the opening. Okay, so I bring my rook across now, basically to force the exchange. And because I'm 2 pawns up, Now I can just simplify. I can force exchanges or equal trades or whatever, and then simply take advantage of the fact that I've got 2 more pawns on the board than my opponent. And these are the E pawn and the A pawn that he does not have. And the thing about moving the rook here is his rook can't move out of the way because I just grabbed the bishop. So the exchange is actually forced. Now I'm attacking the bishop, bishop moves, and now I offer a trade of bishops as well. Black declines the trade of bishops by pinning my bishop. So I can't capture there because if I did, rook takes rook, and that's actually checkmate. So I simply reinforce my bishop with one of my pawns, trying to get my pawns now onto light squares, right? Because what this does is, because I've got this pawn advantage, I've still got 7 pawns on the board. If I can get them onto light squares, both light squared bishops are going to have a lot of trouble moving around the board. However, my bishop is out in front, right? It's like the spearhead of my pawn structure. Now we have the king starting to enter into the game, and I simply finish this lovely light squared structure by pushing c4. Okay, and black's really struggling now at this point. So we have the king comes in, I bring my rook across to defend this pawn again, and now the king comes in again, and now f4. A common pattern when you are facing an opponent's king, because these pawns between them cover all 4 of these squares, so that king is not advancing now. Right? Previously, the king might have had ideas of coming in here, and attacking this pawn here. Now we don't want that to happen. So one way of doing, I could have moved my rook to d1 or to e3, would have been okay, but I figured that f4, it's pressing my advantage that I've got with the pawns. I'm putting pressure on my opponent. I want my opponent to be squirming in his seat at this point, right? So I'm taking squares away from that king permanently, if possible. Okay, pawn push. Now I bring my king into the attack, because my weakness on the board at the moment is d3. So I want to just make sure that that pawn is protected, and ideally without using my rook if I can. So the king's ideal place right now is something like e3, where it's protecting all these pawns, just shoring up my structure. My rook might come, say, to e2, just protecting these guys to prepare for the big push. Okay, so king to f2, and now pawn pushes up, and I simply push now. So this does leave a hole now for the king to come into, but it's too late because I can move my king to here in opposition with black's king, and black's king can't go there or there because my king's in the way. So we have king there, and now king to e3. So, okay, opposition. So where your kings are in line, either vertically or horizontally, and they're 2 squares apart. And because every king has this force field around it, okay, all the squares that it covers, it means that this king cannot progress, cannot move forwards towards my king. Okay, we have h4. Now I move my rook across because now it's time to think about maybe pushing the a pawn up the board. See how I'm just trying to apply pressure in different areas, okay, while maintaining my own king's safety and ensuring that I don't lose. And now g4. And I'm quite happy with this situation. Right, if you ever get this pattern with your pawns and you want to block off that area of the board, just sit tight, it's absolutely fine. Because if this pawn moves forward, I just push g3. But if this pawn moves forward, I just push h3. And the pawns are locked. So I don't have to worry about my defense on that side of the board. So I just simply lift my rook to a2. This is more or less kind of a waiting move. I don't have to do anything now. I just want to wait until my opponent lets me in, basically. Yeah, rook moves across, so the pin's obviously no longer there, and we trade bishops, and now black has horrible isolated double pawns on the c-file, and also both completely unprotected. That's also unprotected there. King's protecting that pawn, rook's protecting that pawn. So a5. And h3, what do? g3, blocked off, no way through, you shall not pass. So the rook comes back, now desperate. Okay, this is the beginning of the end. a5, I push a6. Rook pushes forwards, not a problem. Rook a5 now attacking this pawn. So it's going to force the king to here if he wants to defend it. There he goes. Now I move my king in because this pawn's undefended. Right? This is a walk in the park from this point in time. King takes. King comes forward to attack the rook. No problem. Drop back. Now here black could win a pawn. Right? By capturing, and if rook takes, king takes, whoopee-doo. Okay? So we have the rook across to d7 now attacking this pawn. So what do? Rook a3, defending. So now that pawn is defended, that pawn is defended. The only undefended piece on the board is h2, and he's not going to get to that. He comes across to h7 anyway, and I push a7, and now he's forced to take. Now at this point, I did some counting. And counting in the end game can be very, very important. So what I want to think about doing is, okay, let's say I take, and no, I don't take. Let's say if the rook takes, should I recapture? And if I do, it's going to force the king onto a7. And then I need to think about, okay, well, how could I like capture this pawn and then get back here to defend this pawn? Because clearly that's the king's only option, right? So how many steps would it take? Take. 4 moves. All right? And remember, it's my turn, because if rook captures, king captures, then black's just used this turn. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. How many moves would it take for black's king from here to attack this pawn? Right, and remember, he can't go on this square, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So my king would arrive on e3, and then his king would arrive on c3, no dice. Plus, my h-pawn is now completely unobstructed, right? Unopposed. It can just dance up the h-file all the way there. So we have rook takes, king takes pawn. I have time to catch the pawn. We've established this. King. Okay? So he decides not to come down for this pawn. He decides to go up here for defense. Okay, and we'll just see the finish because it's pretty straightforward. Okay, now we are not in opposition here, right? We're a knight's move apart, so I simply play a waiting move. Now we're in opposition. He's got the opposition, but it's fine. I just push my pawn. King up, takes. Now king back. You see, the issue here is, if I move my king up, well, I suppose I'd have opposition there. We could end up with our kings just moving up and down on the f-file and the h-file. This pawn might advance, but as long as his king is near my king, then I can't step away onto the g-file in order to let my pawn pass. So I don't bother with that idea, just move the king back, right? There we go, and now opposition. So this king cannot advance, but my pawns can. Simple, and now I move my e-pawn. So I'm just I've got my foot on his throat at this point in time. Opposition again. Now, you always have to be very, very careful, okay? One of the things about winning a game is not falling for a stupid stalemate. So I must not stalemate black's king. And it is always a risk. So king goes there, I just push e. King goes there, push e. And he's got nothing to do now. He can't go here. So that's out. The only legal move I've made sure he's got is h8. And if king h8, then queen, and that would be checkmate, and my opponent resigns. So there you go. I mean, was there anything brilliant in that game? I don't think there was anything brilliant going on there. There wasn't anything particularly deep. There wasn't anything particularly special. I just made sure that I applied constant pressure from the start of the game, and that's what you need to do. That's a skill that you need to be developing. So treat every game, if you can, as though you're playing Borghoff from the Queen's Gambit, right? Beth Harmon gets one go in the final episode to one game to defeat Borgoff. And that's how you need to treat it. It's do or die. It's my life depends on this game, right? What do I need to do in order to not just maximize my chances of winning, but to do everything I can to ensure that the game is won? Okay? And when you do that, you will win more. Because that's what you're doing. You are out to win. You're not just out to play chess. And if if you're a beginner, if you're rated below 1,000, say, and you're playing a bunch of blitz games where you're guessing at moves, then you will be losing a lot, because you're not playing the best moves. You're not playing the best moves that you can find, and you're not sitting there with a plan. And you can change your plans. You can change your plans at any time. You have to. You have to be nimble. You have to be ready to change your plan when your opponent does something. When your opponent plays good moves, right? Great, you've played a good move. Now I need to change my plan, but I'm going to beat you. That's what you have. That's the mentality that you need to take into these games. Okay, so we may do more on this in future videos, but that was an absolutely crushing victory today. Very enjoyable game. And it really started right at the beginning, So although it was a fairly dull game, I came out with an attack. I had an idea, right? And it all started really with this queen move. Attack the pawn, threaten checkmate. He has to do something. He makes a pawn move he doesn't want to do. Now I attack the pawn again. Now he brings his queen out. Maybe he didn't want to do that early on, right? Waiting move. I think actually here, yeah, if I'd have played knight to there, he could have just played queen back to e7. Oh no, he couldn't. He could not. So that would have been absolutely killer, I think, as well. That would have been even better, because the queen's under attack. Queen can't go there. But also, with my knight on here, I'm threatening c7, which is horrible. Yeah? So knight there, I don't know. It would have probably been even better. But there you go. Got the job done. That's the important thing. Okay? Brought my pawn out, forced an exchange of queens, and I'm already in the ascendancy on this game. And you see, yet again, the classic simple pawn structure. My light squared bishop is already outside of my light squared pawn chain. My dark squared bishop is free to enter the game. My knights are both developed. My king can then castle. Life is easy. And it was, in the end, an easy game. I just had to make sure. Okay, thank you for watching. Please do subscribe to Chess Bootcamp if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you soon.